Hi, Warren. Thanks so much for joining me again. I'm really excited to catch up and see what's been happening in your world. You've just come back from overseas, is that right?
Good afternoon, Catherine. Yes. Well, I was over there skiing in the at Vale. So pleasure, but you always get to you pick up something whenever you're traveling. Certainly, costs are really out of control in America. I used to go there, probably most years for different conferences and that, and you do some shopping and things were cheaper than here, clothes and food, but it's really out of control over there. Inflation is just terrible. So, and the average wage in America is lower than here. So I just don't know how they survive. So anyway,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
we I live
That
in the best city in the best country in the world, so I'm happy to be back in Brisbane.
Yeah, that I think that all the time. I used to live in America. I did spend some years living in America. And yeah, it's surprising to me because I haven't been there for a long time. So yeah, when you're telling me how expensive things are over there, was that just a holiday then that you were not a business trip?
No, not a business trip. But we were in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and we were staying just one street off Fisherman's Wharf. And 8:30 on a Wednesday night, there's only one restaurant open. They have some serious problems in California, and they're not getting better. They're only getting worse. People are leaving there in droves to go to Texas. And the bigger the debt gets, the more problem they keep increasing the taxes, and so people who can move are moving. So there's some real serious structural issues in lots of parts of America. Some places, the Sun Belt, Florida's going well. Texas is absolutely booming, but they have some real problems. But there's enough opportunities here in Australia for us, Catherine. We don't need to be going over to America.
Yeah, that's true, but it's interesting me what you're saying because Texas survived the global financial crisis very well, particularly because of its taxes there. You don't have state
Yes.
income tax, obviously. It's got very liberal supply policy, so it manages to keep its housing prices relatively low. I know they did have a little bit of a boom in the residential market following the GFC, but seems to me from what you're saying that they're still winning based on that tax
Uh,
structure they've got.
yeah, very much so. When they say that, I think they've got more liberal planning laws. People want to live there. It's I don't want to get into the politics, but some of the things in California. I know some years ago I was at a property council conference in Sydney at the City Hall, and Rudy Giuliani was one of the guest speakers, and he hadn't long been out of being mayor in New York, and he was quite vocal about people sleeping in the streets, and he said, as a civilized society, that doesn't do those people any good or the community any good. Leaving them there, people think that it's good. It is no good for anyone. You shouldn't leave them there. Where in the democratic states, and I'm getting political now, they say leave them. Why should you be interrupting their life? But how are you helping them? Sometimes you actually have to force people into helping themselves. And it's the unemployment, the homelessness in California is just absolutely terrible, and it's getting worse. And there's no way to save it. It's bloody sad, but people just moving to other places, as I say, to Florida or to Texas. Colorado's not too bad, and they've got very liberal drug laws there. So if that's the way you like to go, there's some opportunities there as well.
Yeah, it's a frightening situation, I think, particularly geopolitically, what's going on at the moment with war breaking out in the Middle East. We've got war in Europe. Obviously, America's just not looking in too good a position. They're looking like a weak country. They're not looking like a strong country at the moment. And so, that has implications going forward, particularly if those wars are to spread and get worse, and which is the potential. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the threats of a potential invasion of Taiwan from China. So I think, have you kind of thought about that? Has any of that kind of rested in your consciousness as you've been on your travels, as you've been traveling around America?
All of those things do, Catherine. I say properties. We're not an island. We're influenced by wars. You get what the Houthis are doing with cargo ships, at the moment, well, that increases shipping costs. So that affects us, affects CPI. I think, what is it? Something like 70% of the population in the world are having elections this year. It's the most ever. So I think about those things. The banking situation in United States is just terrible. After the GFC, that the major banks didn't get involved in as much commercial property finance. The smaller mid-tier banks over there, I think if they're all forced into a situation now that they would be bankrupt. In America, you have to have something like 30% of your assets for a bank in treasury bonds. Well, the Silicon Valley Bank that went down, that was their problem. Is they had all that money in T-bonds, and when interest rates have gone up, your treasury bonds were worth like 70 cents in the dollar. So they've lost billions. Now that's the case with most of the banks in America. They would be effectively bankrupt if the US Treasury got serious about it. Now they can't get serious about it because you can't have all the banks going broke. But what's happening with the commercial property loans? They're just not refinancing them. You had a New York bank a month or so ago. Their share price was down 35% in a day, and it's kept going down since. I was recently on a trip over to Ho Chi Minh. We've got a modular housing factory over there we're involved with, where we're bringing modular housing into Northern Australia. That's a story for another day. There's plenty to talk about there. But I ran into some of the leading commercial agents at the Brisbane airport, and then Singapore coming back. And they're over there trying to get Singaporean buyers interested in Brisbane commercial property. Normally at this stage in a cycle, you tend to get the Malaysians, for some reason, come in very early, and the Singaporeans. And they all said that at this stage of the cycle, they're buying in New York and London. That's where the big discounts are. Because our interest rates didn't go as high here, ours isn't as bad. There's certainly the last week we've seen a lot of reasonably high quality property hit the market at massive discounts. But the bigger discounts overseas. Westfield in I think it was Los Angeles, handed back the keys to the bank on a $500 million shopping centre. Just gave the keys back to them and just walked away. Now, I think, is it Cbus, certainly one of our large super funds. It was in the Fin Review very recently. They've done the same over there. So I think it's a crime and everything else in California, but in New York, the money that they need to spend, I think they only had the property 21 months, something like that. The money that you need to spend to bring them up to the current green requirements, they just can't justify doing it. So it's exciting times, but when people have problems, that creates opportunities for others. So this will be an absolutely fantastic year for buying, not a good year for selling. And I think this will certainly be the best year for well over a decade.
Yeah, they're very powerful comments, Warren. We'll certainly come to that in terms of Australia in a moment. But just before we move on from the US, I mean, there's what you're saying is painting a good picture as it is, but there's been a lot of news that's come out about the commercial markets in the US, about the office markets, which have been absolutely decimated over there. Is there any recovery for these markets on the horizon? Because the problem is far worse there than what we've got in Australia. And as you say, there's a lot of banks that are exposed to that sector as well. Have you, is there any hope in the office sector in America?
Well, some areas, it's the IT sectors that have been hit harder, Catherine. And there's an article in the Fin Review today, very poorly written, just hopeless. But anyway, one thing that it does talk about is the people that are working from home. It is more IT. Certainly we don't have anyone working from home. Amazon, a month or two back, certainly this calendar year, opened a new office, which I think is called H2. It's their second headquarters, and people have to be in the office at least 4 days a week. I was in Sydney a couple of weeks ago, and I think Commonwealth Bank, or certainly if they're manager level and above, they all have to be in the office at least 4 days a week, and others at 3 days a week. So they are coming back, but in New York, it's from a very long way behind. And when you had anywhere where you have a very big percentage of your tenants in the IT business. And if you have a look, some of these Google and some of these countries, they've been sacking tens of thousands of people. So I think part of it with this, with the AI is doing some work of those people, and they just don't need as many. And then others that they tend to working at home more. In Brisbane, I can tell you, I actually just walked up the mall to get some lunch a couple of hours ago, and it was just chockers up there. It really was. So I don't get up there much during the day, but it was really busy. So there's actually becoming a shortage of property in Brisbane. We're seeing, incentives are now getting down to the lowest level that I think I've ever seen in commercial property. But we bought something in Melbourne. I think, as you know, at Richmond, settled on the 31st of January. Suburban office is doing well. I was speaking to one of the leading commercial leasing agents, and he said Docklands will be a decade before it recovers. So it's in the article in the Fin today, and it just spoke about vacancies in Australian CBDs, and it made no reference to Brisbane, Sydney, or Melbourne. So it was just a terrible article. It's like if you have your feet in a freezer and your head in an oven, on average you're fine, but you're dying at both ends. So it was it was written by someone who was a former head of the Value General's Department in New South Wales. I suppose what would you expect from a government worker? But just absolutely incompetent writing. Yes, there's some very, very desperate situations in some areas, but in other areas there's fantastic opportunities. So you read his article and you just wouldn't buy property anywhere. Well, that's certainly not the case. As you know, Catherine, there's opportunities in any market. You've just got to seek to find them. But as far as the states, we're just not a buyer over there. Of the properties we bought, we've averaged over 19% internal rate of return over 13 years. We don't need to go to the States to make money. And it's such a big market over there, and I'm happy to be here in Australia.
Yeah,
let's focus on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that in the residential market a lot, because I've helped people buy properties overseas. I help people buy properties in the US. There's the opportunities over here. You think if you're Australian and you've got the opportunity to buy here and to advantage from how the cycle works in Australia, I don't think you can really do better elsewhere. That's my own personal opinion. So we're sort of in agreement on that in residential and commercial. But there was an article that came out in the Fin Review. It came out a couple of days ago. I tweeted it. I might as well have written the article myself for the barrage that I got when I tweeted it. It was calling the bottom in the office sector. It was saying, the big discounting has happened. We've hit the bottom, up to 20% in some cases have come off prices, and it gave a few examples of buildings. And I just quoted a bit from this article, and I just had like a barrage of comments come to me of like, you must be dreaming. How do you know you've hit the bottom? What are the indicators you've hit the bottom? What about work from home? Like all of this stuff. So, I guess where we start, in your opinion, have we hit the bottom of the office sector, generally speaking?
Well, I think as you were alluding to, Catherine, you only know when you look back if you hit the bottom. But that 20% is ridiculous, because the one that we bought in Melbourne was a 39% discount. So I don't know where they get 20. And they say 20% because a lot of the REITs, that's what they've written their properties down. Now, when you're doing valuations as a valuer, you must use comparable evidence. Now, when a market is going down, any evidence you have happened some months ago. Property goes to the market, people negotiate a deal, they'll have 60 or 90 days due diligence, finance, and they settle it. So from start of market to settle it wouldn't be under 3 months, and 3 to 6 months. So that is the sales evidence that a valuer is using that is really 6 months old. So when the market's going down, they normally keep going down. So we had a look at a lot of property yesterday, and some of the discounts that they are now talking really surprised me. There's a building beside where we are. It was under contract maybe mid last year for about 6.75%. It's now under contract for over 8%. Now that's certainly much bigger discount than 20%. And I think at the current price, it is very good buying. Now, I don't think an asset like that will go down any further, but it's probably 40% below. We inspected another property yesterday, which in 2019 they'd paid just on 100 million. They've spent 15 on it, and then because they've got a fair bit of vacancy, they've actually got holding costs. You know, it would owe them well over 120, and it will certainly go for under 80. So there's a $40 million discount. So that's 30%, and so it's probably going to come off a bit more. So 20% is just, that's misleading. And as some by a journalist who just doesn't understand the facts and has probably listened to some fund managers who are praying regularly every night that that's the bottom of the market, but unfortunately the Lord won't be listening to them.
I think the way that it was written is you would assess it was the bottom of the market because they were suggesting that some big players were moving in and that were buying up these blocks at those discounts. So I suppose, you've got kind of like a bit of an increase in demand. You've generally been ahead of the curve anyway, because obviously I came to your last investor evening in Melbourne. You were talking about an office block that you purchased in Melbourne. That was really exciting to me because Melbourne was decimated through COVID, as you know, and we spoke about that a little bit in the last interview. We really suffered with those lockdowns. We had Dan Andrews, that hasn't been fantastic for the property sector. We've got very high office vacancies in the city. So it was exciting to know that you were seeing opportunities, albeit maybe rare, in the Melbourne market. So I think that's kind of like the angle that the article was suggesting. It was saying, Melbourne and Sydney, some of these big players now are moving in, some of the bigger funds are moving in and buying into the office sector. I mean, what are the vacancies like? Is there an indication that there's a bit of a tightening and a bit more demand?
Well, that one you talked about in Melbourne, that was a 40% discount. So the 40% discount, that was a buy, and I think that was probably mispriced. It was worth more than that. And valuers, when you ask them to value a property, Catherine, they have to come up with a valuation. They can't say no buyers, so no value. So coming up with a valuation in today's market, and then you say, well, have you got any buyers? No. So it's been very, very hard for most people to raise equity, and you find a lot of these deals fall over. Ours wasn't the highest offer, but the vendor knew that we could raise the equity, and that's why we got it. So the 40% discount to the top valuation, that's a deal. You said there's a lot of big players coming in. I can tell you there's a lot more bigger players selling out, and it's no secret. They publish their results. It's in the Financial Review. It's in their reports. Mirvac are selling 1.2 billion. Charter Hall Long WALE Fund 550 million. We had a phone call from a group the other day. They need 200 million for redemptions by June 30. Now I'm assuming all those numbers they're mentioning are money that they need this financial year. So if they're not under contract now, then there's no chance of getting the money by June 30. Now, when those deals settle at a discount, that will then be the new valuations that the valuers use, and you'll see valuations at June 30 down, and I think possibly the end of this year we will see the bottom of the market. But if you've got property sitting vacant, like a lot of them are in Sydney and Melbourne, I don't know where they stop. I think and it's not because we're in Brisbane, we'll buy anywhere. But construction prices are the big issue, Catherine. We were speaking to one of the leading agents the other day, and a feasibility they conducted in a prime location. You have to get $1,400 a square metre rent to build something new at a 5.75% yield. Well, you get a valuation at 5.75%, but there'd be no buyers. So you can't build them. So we're seeing rental growth typically in the 30% range for a lot of stuff in Brisbane. Business in Brisbane are growing. We've had a massive population increase. We haven't had as much work from home. In the government end of town, as someone said, that the government workers are as efficient at home as they are at the office. They still do nothing, so it doesn't make a lot of difference. But in the commercial end, most are back in the office. So at one of the prime buildings here that 3 years ago the rents would have been in the order of $900 a square metre with incentives in that 45 to 50%. There was a deal done last week at $1,200 a metre and incentives at 20%. So we're seeing a substantial turn in the market here in Brisbane because, Sydney and Melbourne are always seen as the financial centres for Australia. And people are, and that's where your big super funds are, and they're prepared to speculate, building a 50,000 square metre building. They don't do that here in Brisbane. So they will want to have some form of pre-commitment normally before they start. So we just haven't had the overhang of supply, and because we do have more growth, and we haven't had the big IT sector, we haven't had the vacancies. Now, certainly your B and C grade will continue to struggle because what tenants require now, the cost of doing them, probably make them not viable. But for the A grade buildings, there is a serious shortage. There's a shortage now, and from what I'm hearing in the market, there will be no more buildings start construction in the foreseeable future. Residential, a good friend of mine, a unit he was buying at New Farm, construction costs went from 24 million to 48 million. Now, that's not being built, and we're seeing that across all sectors. So, an article in the Fin today about construction of residential in Sydney CBD, and it's not happening, and they just can't afford to build it. And it's not only the cost of your bricks and mortar and concrete, but the labour practices we have here in Queensland particularly, and I think now we're getting into the other states. One of the major construction sites here in the city, they work 5 days in January. Now, I know there's public holidays in January, but developers that I know very well, when they finish their current projects, residential, no more. So we've got a critical shortage of accommodation, and it can only get worse. In the next couple of years, it'll be far, far worse. And the government talks about, what they're going to do for residential, but that's not going to help. By the government throwing money, and I understand, something's got to happen. But Catherine, if they give you 200 million to go and build some affordable housing, well, you've got to take my staff and staff of other people. You can pay them higher wages and pay more for your materials, and you can deliver the 200 homes or whatever it is you promised the government. But I can't deliver any, and neither can the other person. We have a massive shortage of workers, so it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, we just cannot build any more. And, the government up here has now decided, well, modular is the way to go. Well, the concept's good, but you take 200 tradies or subbies from the suburbs and put them in a factory. Yes, they'll build modular, but then they're not outside working. In the whole of Australia last year, we had 3 apprentice blocklayers finish their apprenticeship. Average age is 60. On the I think it was Monday morning. There's a report come out on universities, and they want to cut the HECS debt and make free university free to everyone. And they want 8 out of every 10 workers by 2050 to have a tertiary education. Well, who's going to work in the shops? Who's building the houses? Who's fixing the cars? Like that's just absolute ridiculous. It is. And they want to do housing. Well, you need bricklayers, you need carpenters, you need plasterers, you need painters, you need electricians. And they're very, very highly paid professions. But because it's not sitting in a university, that they want to look down on it. Now, I've got off the track of vacancies, but it all gets back into we're not building much more, and we can't build much more. We bought Caneland Shopping Centre in Mackay, December 2022. We paid 280 million. To replace that centre is 700 million. There's a lot of shopping, what I would call the Westfield type regional shopping centre. I just don't think we'll ever get those built again. Your David Jones and Myers that you need, along with the Woolies and a Coles and a Kmart, Target, Big W, and then 200-300 specialties. You need those big department stores to pull the crowds in. Well, I don't know the last department store that Myer or David Jones did. It wouldn't have been the last decade, and they're struggling. I think they've probably turned the corner. The Myer we have up in Mackay, that's going extremely well, but they won't build any more. So it comes back, the opportunities this year to buy established property, whether it's residential, retail, industrial, or commercial office, you've just got to look for the right property and make sure it's fit for purpose and tenants want to go there. And you just won't be able to replace those. Your tenants in offices are going to be much more sticky. If you were to take a 10-year lease and you get 50% incentive, you can use all that money to do your fit out. Well, when the incentive gets down to 20% and cost of fit outs go up, you can't do that anymore. So you have to stay where you are. So it's the changes that I don't think anyone has really sat down and take the emotion out of it, just do the mathematics. It's a serious situation for the government, and they have. There's not a chance they get out of the problem they've got with residential. Throwing money at it isn't going to solve it. We need more tradespeople, but the problem is we've got nowhere for them to live, so it's a bit of a circular argument. Hence why we're bringing modular in from overseas. But hey, there's never been a better time to buy existing property and never been easier to make money, let me tell you.
Yes, I love it when you say that, and everything that you're saying is exactly what I see in the residential market. I mean, my day job is a real estate agency, and established housing has continued to do very well. There's been a little bit of a change this year where I've seen more people that have been a bit more willing to go into significant renovation projects. But as you say, nothing is being built because it doesn't make sense. But kind of swinging that back round to the office sector, there's a few things. One is, again, we touched on it last time, but I think it's worth touching on again. I'm interested in your view. And it's this crazy idea to convert office stock into residential stock. And again, article that came out in the AFR about Sydney office stock, saying that a number of years ago, 2-3 years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, there was approval that was given for some of these office blocks to be converted into residential accommodation. Now, of course, the numbers just don't stack up. And that means that we've got old buildings that are not useful as offices, cannot be converted into residential, sitting in our two major capitals on prime land that is essentially unemployed land. It's not being put to productive use. What is the solution there? And in terms of talking about this as well, I want you to point out, because I think a lot of people get confused about this also, is when we're talking about office stock, we're drawing a distinction between good stock, which is going to come under demand and more demand as the workers that are needed to be in the offices will, return to the office. And then this type of stock, which, is old and on its way out. I mean, is there a solution for these buildings? What have you thought about that?
The wrecking ball, that will fix them. If they're not fit for office, they're not fit for residential. You just have to wait till the owners write the value down enough, or the banks take them back and demolish them. What else can you do, Catherine? There's, these people who have do all the study and come up with great ideas for converting office to residential. I've been saying for years it's just ridiculous. I think there's only one in Brisbane that had happened, and that's a hotel down in the corner of Albert and Mary Street, because it was a 700-metre small floor plates. For residential, you have to have natural light. You can only be so far from natural light and you've got to have habitable rooms, bedrooms. You've got to have natural light. So big floor plates don't work. So you've got to have small floor plates. But then you've got to have your emergency exits, your fire stairs in the right place. You then have to have, when you do every unit, we'll have toilets, bathrooms, kitchens, laundries. So you've got to bring all that plumbing in. In a typical office floor, you'll have some central toilets, male, female, handicapped, and then you'll have a couple of kitchens around the place. So the changes that you'll have to do to modify them for residential, but then they're still not built to purpose. You're bastardising the existing building to try and make it work. Anyone that is going to buy it isn't going to pay the same price they would for a new building. So you've then got to discount it. And most office buildings, they just don't supply the amount of car parking that most residential buildings need. So there's very, very few. You get these people say this is one of the solutions. Once again, I think there's an article in the Fin today. There's been dozens of projects that are approved, but well, one, they didn't start because it just really didn't work. But the numbers don't work, and it's just ridiculous. But people keep saying it. You don't have to have intelligence to get a microphone. Now people say yes, right back at you, mate. But they make these statements, and they're misleading, because you can see that it just hasn't happened, Catherine, and it won't happen. So eventually, those buildings will have to be demolished. If you can't use them for commercial or residential, then there is no other use. They will have to come down, and it's and eventually the holding costs will kill people. Your rates and land tax and everything else, and you'll have dilapidated buildings. But what else? There aren't any other options. So.
Well, the other option that was suggested, I'm actually wondering whether you've looked into this sector yourself, is build to rent. Because the build to rent sector, it's not anywhere near as popular over here as it is overseas. It's growing over here because obviously they've been giving hefty land tax discounts. I think 50% land tax discount for building build to rent. They're not even necessarily offering affordable rentals. I mean, they seem to be aimed at obviously the people that are investing in them want to maximize the rental that they can get. But there seems to be demand for it. Melbourne's leading, I think, in terms of the number of build to rent projects that have started. Is it an area that you've looked at yourself?
Didn't take us long to look. I just can't see how they can make money out of it. You know what residential rentals are. The yield that you get, Catherine. So most people buy residential properties for capital gain. If you weren't going to get capital gain, then you wouldn't own residential properties. Now, they're building these properties at the top of the cycle in construction costs. Well, where is the capital gain? And I look at and I know it'll offend a lot of people. I go to a lot of conferences, and residential property is the only investment sector when they post the returns, they never say net or gross. In every other sector, they do. And that's because the yields are gross. If you put up gross, then some people are going to say, what's the net return? And then when they do say, they won't take into account, they'll just put insurance and rates and land tax, whatever, but they won't do a sinking fund for repairs and maintenance and all the other things like we do in commercial. So if you don't get capital gain, you just wouldn't buy residential. But when you get into this build to rent, with construction prices where they are, now I saw one, I won't name that, but a very well-known development company who reported another loss, I think 20 years in a row or something. It wouldn't be hard to work it out. And they got a joint venture partner in to do build to rent a year ago, and they said it would be a 11% internal rate of return over 10 years. Now that's pretty good. Initial return was 5.3. Now, because they didn't say net, I've got to assume it's gross. I will assume it's gross. So if it's 5.3 gross, then it's probably 3.5% net. Now, given that's your starting yield, how do you get to 11% internal rate of return? Now, I haven't done the numbers, but to get from 3.5% annual return to 11% is going to be a lot of years. But to get it to 11% compounding, Catherine, I've never seen a feasibility that didn't work, never. But I've seen plenty of projects that didn't work, and because once reality hits, they don't take into account all the things. And at the moment, you've got the rising construction costs. There's one just straight across the river here at Kangaroo Point. Construction costs in 18 months went from 45, 65, 75. Then he signed a fixed price contract. He was then forced into doing an EBA very recently, which added 22 million to the $75 million construction costs. Now, it was a very profitable project. I hope that he gets out of it, because it certainly hasn't been his fault. But you start with these build to rents, and they'll have of course, it'll be showing a profit day one, but when they get it finished, does it really show a profit? I have absolutely no interest in it. These big institutions, the superannuation funds, they have money coming in every week. They can't stop it from compulsory superannuation. They have to do something with it. As a fellow, I know a good friend of mine working for one of the large super funds. I asked him a few years ago why they bought a shopping centre for 104 million. He said, well, when you're getting 400 million coming in every month, you've got to do something with it. And I think that's what it is with some of these super funds. Now, they can get my phone number and ring me. I'm always happy to talk to them. I'd rather do it with an audience. I just think it's just absolute rubbish. In America, they had a lot of the the family, what they call family accommodation. But you're buying them at 7 or 8%, Catherine. That's a fair investment. Not buying them at 4%, which is not a true net return. And then all the limitations, and you would see with your clients that you have as a landlord, you don't control the property. If they don't want to get out, it's very hard forcing them out. They wreck the place. Insurance only covers so much. It's getting more and more difficult being a residential landlord, and I don't want to be too harsh, but it does quite often. The less rent that gets paid, the less people care about a property. So it's I just don't think the build to rent will work. I can, one of the big players that's there today, but given he was our ex-Australian treasurer, the best treasurer in the world, it was said, he will get the support for it. I just don't think they'll make money on it. The difference, I know most of our investors, and I value their money, and I won't just throw it at something, and I hope that'll make money. I'm from the Kerry Packer school. A long-term deal is a short-term deal gone wrong. That's why we buy primarily income-producing property, so we can start paying distributions 30 days after we settle, not 3 or 5 years when a project is finished and construction costs have blown out and rents didn't grow like you're thinking. If you've got working on a 10-year project, you've got 10 years to make a profit. Where that's not the sort of assets I like to get into. But when you get someone like Harry Triguboff, who said he's getting out of Sydney, you just can't make money. Do you want to believe Harry is worth 24 billion, or someone else who it's not? With Harry, it's his money. If there was money in it, he would be doing it. Where these others, it's not their money. And you have a look at the annual reports they're bringing down now. One of the big boys wrote off $800 million in a shopping centre in Hawaii. They can still drink champagne. It's not their money. Anyway.
Look, it's interesting because, I think in terms of apartment stock, and I've always said this to the clients that I've dealt with, is I'm not in favour of any investment in residential apartments because, if you were living in London, you had no choice to live in an apartment, it's different. But in Australia, when you drill down into the demographics, there's only a very small demographic that actually lives in apartments. Most people and most of the demand for housing are young couples that are thinking about having a family, families with children, and that's in areas where they've got a good distance to a good established school and a good established shopping strip. I mean, that's the land that attracts the growth. And I just think that's why we've been littered with so many empty apartments in the capital cities, particularly. And that has happened in Brisbane as well. Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane have had a history of having a lot of apartments that are sat there empty. The building quality isn't great, they depreciate very quickly, they don't hold their value. So I'm not in favor of them myself. What I'm interested in when you're looking at investments in the city, when you're looking at office stock, is what is it that needs to be identified in that office building in order for you to go for it and to say, okay, this is a good quality building, this is something that we can potentially want to invest in. Is there what's your tick list that you need to tick off?
Catherine, if I don't say something, people think that I'm agreeing everything with what you say. As far as residential, I'm not a residential investor. I don't like it. I own my own properties that we use ourselves. I'm just buying something else for the staff to use at the moment. But I've helped a couple of my friends buy, and some of the opportunities in apartments I'm seeing are when you're buying things a quarter of replacement cost. And 90% of the time, residential apartments are a terrible investment. Terrible. But every now and then, and I saw it about 20 years ago, when you get such a disjoint between existing product and new product, you do need to look at. Now, some of the buildings you don't go into because they were built bad, and we've seen some of them on the TV, and but there's some. I know Brisbane, and a very good friend of mine who is a very large developer, private, and does absolutely high quality. Now, he told me just before Christmas he cannot make money delivering units at $23 a square metre. Now, when I see properties going at under 10,000, now these certainly not the quality of his, but they're CBD. Some of these you could not build them for 25 or 30,000 a metre. Now, when you can buy them at 10,000, and the thing, if you buy something a few years old, Catherine, you can see how it's holding up. You can see if the tiles are falling off and if the kitchens are had and everything else. And a particular block that a friend of mine bought one in last September, they were 360,000. Now they're 480. Now that 360,000, if your clients, and they're yielding 8% gross. Now, if you bought that last September and threw down 100,000, borrowed 260, you've doubled your equity. Now, it's not going to keep going, but I think there's more in it because I know what you say about now. I've got 2 young children. Now, people think I'm too old, but my wife isn't. Now, we live in the city, but we overlook the Botanic Gardens. So that's their playground. Now, it certainly isn't for everyone. But, there's the students live in the city, in all cities. Single workers or couples without children. And as the traffic gets worse, more people live in the city. I know people, ideally, they'd like to have, people wanted the quarter-acre block with the house, and there was an 800 square metre block, and now a 400 square metre block is big, and they're getting down to under 200. They're basically apartments just sitting side by side, and then you've got to sit in the traffic for an hour and a half. So I think as the traffic gets worse, we've got one over here at South Brisbane or West End, built on the old Peter ice cream factory, West End Village, and it's really nice. Now, they don't have the sporting fields and that in the development, but for people working in the city, when I lived at Roma Street Parklands, people there moved in from acreage, half an hour from the city, because their boys went to private school and they'd have swimming lessons at 6 o'clock and rowing lessons, and that was so people are changing, and a lot of times you'll see people buy. Well, I've got a unit down at Broadbeach. I paid $735,000 off the receivers on the 12th of February 2012. The woman that had it paid $1.4 million off the plan in 2007. So 5 years later, I paid half the price. Similar properties now are going for 1.3. So after 16 years, they're almost back to where they were. So what you say is 100% right. But if you bought it at 735 when I did, and that's what land is what goes up in value. Concrete materials, they'll be stagnant for a while. But if you can buy them at less than half of replacement cost, and it's a pretty fair building, then I think you should give consideration. It's opportunities in every market. You don't just go and say buy units, as you wouldn't just say to people go and buy a house. Look at the right location. Is it priced right? And I just think it gets back to the construction cost, Catherine. Construction prices are so out of control. There's a window here that gets us into the offices. Now, I've never been a real buyer of properties offices in the city because the incentives are too high. You get $800 a metre, and you give the buyer the thing at 6% yield, and to lease it up, you give 50% incentive. So you bought at 6%, take 50% off 6%, you actually got a 3% yield. How the hell is that a deal? But smokes and mirrors, institutions did it for years and years, and the incentive was put down as a capital cost. but you've got to keep doing the capital every 5 years. So it's but at the moment, as I was saying before, replacement cost, you could not do anything in the city here, I think, for under $1,400 a square metre rent. Now, yes, that's going to be a brand new building, but when you can buy an existing building where tenants are paying $700 a square metre, now you might have to spend something on a refurbishment, but if you can spend a substantial amount and then get your rent up to $900 a square metre, compared with where they'd go for new and at $1,400. Now, as I said, the figures that were done by the leading agency up here and leading agency in the world for $1,400 a square metre, that's of quantity surveyors. You then have to go and get a builder to sign up and do it. Now, these days, I know on the Gold Coast, there's only 2 builders. They're private, high-quality builders. The only contract they will sign is cost plus 10%. So most people, including us, we couldn't get funding off the bank if you can't lock in the construction price. So it's prohibitive. Once you get Harry Triggerboff, who I respect enormously, he can do it because there's no doubt whatever the price is, he can fund it. So it's stopping down the coast. Now that'll be the same here. When construction of a building takes a few years, who knows where construction prices are going? So the builders, hundreds of builders have gone broke around Australia. They won't sign a fixed price contract. So you might get a quantity surveyor to say today, here's your construction price. You do a feasibility, you need $1,400 a square metre to build it. Then you've got to get a contractor, a builder, to sign a contract. And I don't think you would. The only work that will be getting done now is government. And government are very free and easy with our money, as you know, Catherine. And the amount of infrastructure work that we have in Queensland with hospitals and freeways and Cross River Rail, and it's just disgraceful, the cost blowouts, from 5 billion to 7 billion, and it's just telephone numbers. The government does it, and no one seems to be responsible. Well, they just keep doing it. But private enterprise can't. So I believe there is going to be such a drastic shortage of office space. Certainly, buildings that just don't comply won't lease up. But when you have a look, you've got to have a look at, how leaseable is this? We've got our own leasing agents who are, I think, are very good. But we'll get the major leasing agents. What inquiry? What are tenants looking for? Depending on the floor plan, how easy it is to split. If you have what we call a side core, so you have your lifts and everything over the side, that's great for a full floor tenant. But when you have to split the floor up for smaller tenants, you lose a lot of common area. So with that, with a lot of them, you want a central core, so it's easier to split into smaller tenancies. How easy it is to split. People want more natural light. The older buildings quite often had the metal spandrel panels, so you'd only have glass halfway up. Can you pull those panels out and put glass? What is that going to cost? How good is the air conditioning? What have you got to do to get it up to a 5-star neighbours rating? All of those things that you look at. We're looking at something that it's probably a 10, 15-year hold, and then it would be a fantastic redevelopment site. What's happening in the area in Brisbane? We have a Cross River Rail that is going to come out in Albert Street, corner of Mary. Well, that has sort of been a no man's land down there. You haven't had the bus interchange, and it's a long way from Central Station. But you have a new station go there, all of a sudden it opens up, that part of the city for more office workers. So, all of those things we look at, how easy it is to lease up, what's the demand, different sectors, car parks. Is there enough car parks for the type of tenant that you're attracting? Are you in the government sector? Are you in commercial sector? I think it's probably no doubt no different to the advice you give your clients on housing. That there's, how close is it to a school? What amenities are around it? Where's the bus stop? Where's the public transport? Does it need a refurbishment? Does it have asbestos? All of those things you look at. There's a lot of things, but there are some sensational opportunities around it, and our target is to try and buy $1 billion worth of property this year, and I just think we'll see the market turn very quickly. it happens in most areas. Once you get down to a bottom, and you only know the bottom when you look back, but the hundreds of millions of dollars of money that comes into superannuation funds every month, and typically they have 7 to 9% of that invested in commercial property. Now, most must sellers now because they bought it at the wrong time. In a couple of years, they're going to be buying back in. And, as I've been banging on about, we're just not building much because we can't. So what does that do to the existing assets? We started in the GFC and did enormously well. But then we made our money from yield compression. You're buying things at 10 to 12%, and you're selling them at 7 or 8%, and leasing up vacancies. We really didn't get that much rental growth, and there wasn't certainly in the areas that we were buying in the industrial, the large format, homemaker centres and shopping centres. There really wasn't a lot of excess capacity. So you got yield compression and lease up the vacancies. But now the rental growth, like we've got a couple of office buildings where we've got between 30 and 35% rental growth and zero incentive. Now, I've never seen that in my 30 odd years in commercial property. So, but I'm not buying in the Melbourne CBD because that's a bit of a ghost town, but that, there's been a number of things that have caused that. There's oversupply. There's a lot of money there. So, most people tend to invest around where they live, so that the big money's there. So they build the big projects, and they all want to get mine's bigger than yours, and hence they've got the problem. And then, the Premier Daniel Andrews, some of the things he brought in the last budget certainly weren't conducive to encourage growth in businesses. But in saying that, I know in the Fin Review, or someone did a report to say that the Victoria was the best growth state in Australia. Now, in that, they never actually had facts and figures. They didn't have population or any facts and figures. It was just on how good did people feel. Well, I suppose if you've been held underwater for half an hour and you get pulled out, you feel pretty good. So I'm not sure what it's based upon, but we bought something down there, and Melbourne will always be a great city. There's no doubt about it. But they did have a pretty hard time, and there's significant oversupply in the city, and there's still more coming on, and some of the work practices, they're not back to work as much as we didn't have the COVID as bad up here. So up north, when we bought a Caneland shopping centre, that the bank asked the centre manager, "How did you handle COVID?" And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, how many days were you closed?" We didn't close it, not one day. So we just didn't have it as bad up here. So the issues just never got quite as bad as they did down south. But that creates opportunities, Catherine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of apartments, I've seen very, very few. When you look back at the historical growth that have really done well in terms of capital growth, but obviously, those outliers, if they've got a great view and they're great quality apartment, I mean, that there's not the same as, as you're talking about in office buildings, there's not a massive amount of great quality apartments.
No, it's not.
But yeah, certainly keeping an eye out, looking for those opportunities. So, I mean, I think what got excited as well when people were looking at this idea that, office stock at bottom was that the articles kind of came out on the back of that was saying, okay, now we're looking at interest rates dropping. There's a lot of talk about, we've reached peak inflation. I can't tell you how many times I've done interviews since rates started to go up that have said we've reached peak inflation and now rates are going to start to come down. The conversation hasn't changed sort of over the last sort of 12 months. And so the idea that the interest rates, that the cash rate might fall and that might, give a bit of ease in finance is getting people excited about REITs, as to whether it's a good time to enter those as well. Now, I'm not forecasting that rates are going to fall. I feel that we're in an inflationary cycle still, and particularly, with where we started the conversation in terms of the supply lanes, which are being under threat at the moment from war, not to mention, what's going on in the Panama Canal. But what's your view on that?
Catherine, well, when interest rates we're pretty close to zero, and I would get people telling me how much interest rates weren't going to go up, and I said, oh, well, I know they'll go up, but I don't know when and by how much. And we budgeted about 4 years ago on rates peaking at 4.1. Now, we didn't get it right, but we weren't too far out. And for a while, we looked like being right. I don't think interest rates are going to go up anymore. But once again, if you can buy assets, as we did with that one down in Victoria, and make them work at these interest rates, well, when they do come down, it's just a positive. Now, if interest rates were to come off 1% in the next quarter, these funds that have got issues, that's not going to save them. It's too late. The people who bought properties at 3% and 4%, and there was a lot of that, they can't be saved. So it's too late. And I understand with a lot of the banks, they're not foreclosing like they did in the GFC. They're just not refinancing. So what happens with that is they're happy for them to sit there. They charge penalty interest, and then as their valuations come down, they get breach of their loan covenants and everything else. So I believe interest rates will come down. When and how much, I don't know. I'm happy for them to stay where they are for another 12 months. You get mixed messages. It's certainly in Northern Australia where we are very long. We're not seeing the problems there, but you get a place like Mackay, when your average wage isn't much different to Sydney, but you've got the average house price at 500,000 in Mackay, the average house price in Sydney, I don't know, 1.5 million. In Mackay, you probably average 10 minutes drive to work. In Sydney, it's an hour. In Sydney, you've got to pay for parking. In Mackay, you do, but it's $2. So we don't have the issues up north that they do down south, but I do hear that there's a lot of issues in some areas down there. You see the arrears coming up in the banking for loans. The wealthy are doing very well, and the not so well off are doing it pretty tough. But we're now getting wage inflation, which causes another issue. So I read an article from CBA, their head economist, a couple of weeks ago, where his view was we get interest rate reductions of 0.75 this year and another 0.75 next year. We can all have an opinion. CBA, I think, have been fairly accurate, and I think they put a lot of work into it. So maybe towards, who knows what happens in 9 months' time. We just, when you ask me a question, how could I know what's going to happen on the other side of the world with wars and oil price and all these other things, and they all affect interest rates. I don't think interest rates are going to go up anymore. We're buying property on the basis that if it works at our cost of debt of sort of 6.4 or something, and the way we gear ours, every 0.25% reduction in cost of debt increase our distribution by 0.5%. I'm happy for no movement this year, and we buy another $1 billion worth of assets, and then interest rates start to come down and yields compress, and you make another couple $100 million. It's great times.
You're the property whisperer, Warren. I expect you to know these things. I expect you to have foresight on what's coming ahead and be able to tell us with what's going on.
Well, I'm just telling you, it's never been a better time to buy, Catherine, and make sure you can keep paying your interest rates, keep paying the banks at these rates, and eventually they will come down. If you're buying things on the basis that interest rates will be down 0.5% at the end of the year and they don't come down, then you have a problem. If you look at everything on worst case possible, then you'll never be disappointed. So I just know, when people were telling us to lock in rates, whenever it was 5 years ago at 5.5%, we didn't lock them in, and then they got down to 3%. I just thought they're going to come down. I didn't know when. Like now, I think rates will come down. When? I don't know. But if you can make things work at a cost of debt of 6.5, I tell you, they'll work a hell of a lot better at 5.5. Catherine, I've got to go. Sorry, I don't want to be rude,
okay,
but
I was going to ask about your whether my subscribers can come along to your investor night in Melbourne that we that you mentioned to me? Do you have anything that they can tap into and learn a little bit about the opportunities that are coming up?
We have, what I'll do is Anthony will stay in touch with you, because we have limited numbers. You know, while we've got the MCG, I think we can only get 100,000 in, so we probably can't get all of your listeners. But I think we'll certainly be able to sum it, and I suppose whether you do some draw or competition, or you know, we just won't be able to have everyone, but certainly we'd love to be able to work with your people, and you know, happy to talk to them, ask questions, you know, anytime they want. You know, you've got my phone number, so yeah, it's so exciting times ahead though, Catherine. The way these construction prices are going, that creates opportunities like we haven't seen for a decade.
Yeah. Thanks, Warren. I love the positivity. It's great to talk to you, and yeah, we'll do it again, I'm sure.
Look forward to catching up next time in Melbourne.
Excellent. Okay, we'll talk soon.
Terrific. Thanks, Catherine. Bye.